This week, IndyCar held spring training in Austin, Texas at Circuit of the Americas, and in this video I'll break down most of the things that we learned in that test. We had a bunch of new rookies, a lot of guys coming over from Europe and Japan that you may be familiar with if you're in the Formula One circles, but you might not be so familiar with if you are in an IndyCar circle, so we're going to talk about them. And the real shine and the star was certainly Scott McLaughlin and the incredible emergence of the Supercar champion. This man is truly something special. This was also an incredibly important event because it was the first time we'd publicly seen more than 20 cars out on the racetrack with or featuring the brand new Aeroscreen, the new cockpit safety device for IndyCar, which integrates both a windscreen element, a clear windscreen element, as well as a Formula One style halo. And because the weather was so nasty, they really only had about one day to truly test it. I think it was a really good litmus test for the Aeroscreen because these were conditions that were outstanding, and it seemed like by all accounts the drivers were able to see, and there were no real problems with that. Speaking of not being able to see, you may be watching this video and you may be unaware that, believe it or not, this test was streamed live for free on YouTube. And the reason you may not have understood or known that it was actually being streamed on YouTube was because IndyCar decided to stream the test as unlisted. Now, what is the difference between unlisted and public, or a public stream, or a public video, or whatever? When you unlist a video, the video is still technically public, but it will not be suggested, it will not show up in subscription feeds, and the only way you can really get to it is if you have the link to it. Now, that being said, IndyCar, I think, still did some pretty great numbers, and I want to be very clear in saying that I think it's a great thing that IndyCar is willing to go out there and stream these tests for the fans. The problem was, are you really getting a great return on your investment when you send the production trucks out there, you hire talent, or you employ talent for the weekend to man the cameras, to broadcast, to direct, all those things, to get 3,500 viewers? That was the peak that I saw. It may have gone a little bit higher than that, but when you look across the aisle and you look at, on, I think it was Tuesday, Ferrari and Formula One had a public live stream on their channel where they got 130,000 people to watch a Ferrari unveiling that was inspired by the Star Wars holiday special. It was very strange, but they had over 100,000 people watching that. You think about eNASCAR, which had a public stream that was streamed all across social media, not just on YouTube, but it was on YouTube, and it had 5,000 viewers toward the end of the race. An esports broadcast brought in somewhere around 12 to 20,000 people watching simultaneously across social media. Real Motorsport theoretically should get more views than that. The Bathurst 12-hour, which ended 2 a.m. American time, that had something like 10,000 people watching at the end of the race. And I know I'm not going to make any friends by saying any of this. I mean, I'm well aware at this point that opinions like this are not particularly appreciated. But I will tell you this, and if you hate me, trust me on this. Listen to me here. This is something I actually know what I'm talking about. If you don't think I know anything else I'm talking about, I will say with true authority that I understand YouTube algorithm and I understand the power of social media and how to unlock it, especially in a context of IndyCar coverage. And this honestly made me want to tear my hair out. And I want the same thing everybody else does, honestly. I want this sport to be seen. I want people to be able to find it. And in my mind, if you are paying for the trucks, the production crew, everybody to go out there, why on earth, and you're streaming it for free. This was not an NBC deal. NBC was not in the way of this. NBC did not make them stream this on gold. This was free to watch. Why on earth would you make it more difficult? Or let me put it this way, why wouldn't you want this to be about as easy to find as possible? And let me put some numbers, or throw some numbers at you really quick. Just on YouTube alone, there are 250,000 subscribers on the IndyCar YouTube channel. If this video had been made public, those subscribers would have been notified, or they would have at least seen it when it went live in their subscription feed. The viewers who have notifications, the notification bell dinged, they would have had an email sent to them that this was happening. And here's the deal. It's the week of the Daytona 500. When we're talking the YouTube algorithm, there is a ton of auto racing related videos being uploaded by non-auto racing channels. So when someone clicks on an auto racing video, they're going to start getting suggested, at least for a little while, auto racing related content. Not only to mention, there were also the big Formula One car launches this week. There's another big auto racing thing that is helping drive the YouTube algorithm to suggest auto racing videos. Let me tell you another thing about YouTube and live streaming. YouTube really likes live streaming. They like it when there is a big live stream that is getting a lot of people in there and a lot of chat interaction. Alone, IndyCar was able to get 3,500 people in that live stream. That stream with that many people would have been suggested and possibly gotten on the trending page just by having that many people. And I'm telling you, if it would have been public, there probably would have been 2 or 3 times that many people just organically coming in and finding that. Now let's talk about the rest of social media, because quite honestly, in my opinion, IndyCar should have been streaming this on all their platforms. Think about this. On Facebook, they nearly have 1 million likes. Had they been streaming this on Facebook, there would have been 900,000 people that potentially could have been exposed to this test, this live stream, this broadcast. Twitter, 300,000 people. Why weren't they streaming on Twitter? Why not Twitch? Well, I don't think they have a Twitch channel because they haven't had a video game in 15 years. But my point remains. Think about this. You sent all those production trucks out there to get 3,500 views at a peak. Those were, I assume, the reason that was because you were trying to draw traffic to the app and the website. I understand, but I think there was a way better way to do this. If you'd made the stream completely public, streamed it on all your social media platforms, you could have run a ticker on the bottom that says, go to the app for timing and scoring. I don't know. If you could have gotten 10, 20, 30, 50,000 people tuning in yesterday and the day before to testing, how many more people would have downloaded the app? Rather, you decided to pander to the 3,500 hardcore fans that have probably already downloaded the app. But what do I know? It doesn't make any sense to me. Sorry I had to rant about this. Let's actually talk about what happened during the test, because it really was very interesting. Not really much of a surprise, but it was Will Power on top at the end of the day. He certainly is looking for redemption, at least at Circuit of the Americas, because he was leading, dominating that race, and kind of fell out of it at the end of the day. Second place was Alexander Rossi. Again, not much of a surprise. Alexander Rossi is always fast throughout IndyCar. Just the last 3 years, he's just been one of the best drivers in the series. But here's where we start to get into the really amazing stuff. And third was Scott McLaughlin, the Supercars champion, New Zealand born and bred. Amazing. I mean, I cannot, because I told you in This Week in Racing last week that the hype really needs to be believed and ramped up about Scott McLaughlin. Roger Penske does not throw around a Rick Mears comparison lightly. And yet, he said that Scott McLaughlin reminds him an incredible amount of Rick Mears. And this guy has not sat in a Formula car since 2010, prior to testing at Sebring a couple of weeks ago. I can tell you specifically, because Scott McLaughlin, the last time he was in a Formula car was a Formula Ford. I have driven a Formula Ford. There is a fear factor in getting in a Formula Ford out of a go-kart. There is a mental bridge that you have to cross just to drive that car at anywhere close to the limit. And I can imagine that having that kind of in your bank as your last open wheel car experience, and then jumping into something that actually has downforce, that has way more horsepower, probably about 5 times more horsepower than a Formula Ford, infinitely more downforce, bigger tires, grippier tires, way faster. Oh, and then, by the way, you have to go out there and you have to perform up against Will Power and Scott Dixon and Alexander Rossi. And it's being streamed on YouTube, even though it's unlisted. And there are the eyes of the world, so to speak, on you. That's an incredible amount of pressure. And to drive to third place in the second time you've been in an Indy car, that is incredible, okay? Scott McLaughlin, You got to believe the hype. You have got to believe the hype. Now, we'll see how he does. Penske is actually bringing, and this is something really, like, then it starts to blow your mind, because Penske is bringing him to Texas Motor Speedway for an oval test. So where does this all end up going? We know he's doing the IndyCar Grand Prix at Indianapolis. How many more races is he going to do this year? I don't know. We'll find out. P4. And this should, again, speak to what Scott McLaughlin was able to do. IndyCar champ, Joseph Newgarden. So McLaughlin outdid Joseph Newgarden. 5th, defending winner at Circuit of the Americas, and a guy who was a second faster than everybody else at the test last year, Colton Herta. Just, again, let's talk about that. Or let's make note of that. Let's make another note. 6th place was Simon Pagenaud. The slowest of the Penske drivers, the defending Indy 500 winner. And I don't mean slowest because, let's face it, he's still in the top 10, so that's not really a big deal, and it could have been any number of things that would have kept him down there. I think the point being is the Penske guys are all really, really fast this year. 7th place, and this is where we start talking about a new team, or at least a new team collaboration. McLaren, or Aero McLaren SP. McLaren. Oliver Askew, Indy Lights champion. Definitely impressed, I would say. Quietly, though, because I think, again, a lot of the hype machine's looking at Scott McLaughlin. But if you look at what Aero McLaren SP was able to do in this test, really good start for them. Really good start, kind of starting fresh. Again, they're going to have to shed a little bit of what happened last year with the Carlin partnership. Obviously, they're now partnered with Sam Schmidt's team and Aero Electronics. It's a different situation now. But it looks like right now, the pieces that they've put in place have got them right where they want to be. They're right in that upper echelon of teams. Speaking of, right behind Oliver Askew was Scott Dixon. So that can tell you right there, if we're looking at teams in terms of performance, you've got Penske, Andretti, McLaren, and Ganassi. And that really stays true for the rest of the top 10. Outside of this driver, and this is another driver that we need to keep an eye on. And in fact, Colton Herta, when I interviewed him at the Rolex 24, specifically pointed out this driver as someone that you guys should be watching. Alex Palou, driving for a combination of Dale Coyne Racing and Team Go out of Japan. And in fact, one of the best looking cars in the entire field, in my opinion, because it's got the former McLaren F1 GTR livery from 1997. Absolutely fantastic. Just a bright pink fluorescent car with gray. Looks unbelievable. But Alex Palou is very highly regarded by Honda, very highly regarded by Team Go, and I think he should be very highly regarded by IndyCar fans because it's pretty clear the guy's got a lot of talent. We go to P10 and the end of the top 10, Pato O'Ward. Not, again, it shouldn't be a shock, but maybe it is a shock to some that McLaren is right there immediately. Both drivers in the top 10. And Pato O'Ward, I think, was one of the faster drivers when it was kind of colder. When it warmed up a little bit, he kind of fell behind some of the other guys. But it definitely looks like the McLaren team is going to be very competitive this year. Then we talk about some other notable drivers, kind of further down the field, but a lot of the rookies and some of the other drivers that have switched teams I wanted to talk about. Rinus VeeKay was in 18th position, but here's the notable thing about that, driving for Ed Carpenter Racing. He did the most laps in testing. He did 82 laps. That was like 10 or 15 laps more than the next closest guy, who I think was Max Chilton, driving for Carlin Racing. So clearly, Rinus VeeKay, the Dutchman, did a ton of work. And again, he's a very highly regarded driver. He was second in the Indy Lights Championship last year. He's someone to watch, I would say. Sergio Sete-Camera, who is a Brazilian driver, Formula 2 experience, been rumored forever to have an IndyCar drive. Hasn't quite signed one yet, but he was testing for Carlin. He ended up in 21st position out of 27 drivers. There were less cars. There were more drivers than cars, but regardless, that was one that I think a lot of people were interested to see how he would do. He didn't get a ton of track time, but I think the track time he did get was valuable. And he didn't throw the car into the wall. He didn't throw it off the track. And I think he performed about as well as you could given the circumstances, because he was another one of those drivers that had to share a car. And I'll talk about his car mate here in just a second. Sebastian Bourdais was in 24th position in his first outing for AJ Foyt Racing. And I want to put a big asterisk beside that, because when Sebastian Bourdais got out of the car, the conditions were awful. It was still kind of raining. It was still cold. And at the time, he was right up. He led the session for a pretty long time. So I would say that was not representative of how well Sebastian Bourdais performed. And had he been in the 14 AJ Foyt car the rest of the day, he may well have been charging up in that top 10. Felipe Nasr, Brazilian driver, IMSA experience, Formula One experience, driving for Carlin, sharing the car with Sete-Camera. He was another driver who only got to race or drive the car when it was cold, so wasn't super representative of what he actually did, being in 26th position at the end of the day. But he's another one to watch. It'll be interesting to see, because he's got that full-time IMSA drive, how many IndyCar races he's able to do this year. Is he willing to do the ovals? There's some questions there, but it was worth noting. And finally, last place was Dalton Kellett, one of the most experienced Indy Lights drivers in the history of the sport. Canadian driver, driving the 14 for AJ Foyt. Now, the reason he was down there was essentially he was the latest driver of anybody to get out on track. He didn't have very much time in the car. I think it was the first time he'd ever sat in an AJ Foyt Indy car. He's tested for Andretti Autosport before, so he's not inexperienced, but unfortunately he just kind of caught the short end of the stick in testing because of the way the weather was, essentially losing the first day to nasty conditions, and then going into the second day where it was pretty much a scramble just to get Bourdais to set the car up, and then finally get it switched over and put Kellett in and send him out. And finally, I want to discuss very briefly the Aeroscreen itself. Now, I was at the very first test for this particular style of Aeroscreen at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. It's definitely grown on me since then. I think it looks a lot better now that it has the livery on it. And at speed, I even mentioned this back at the Indianapolis test. In fact, I was wearing the same shirt I am now, believe it or not. But when it's at speed, even if it's on a TV camera, you don't notice it nearly as much. It's something that you see, but you don't really see after a while. In fact, the cars really, especially on the road courses, give off quite like a 2008 LMP1 vibe, which in my opinion isn't a terrible thing at all. I think they look pretty cool, to be honest with you, and I think the livery designers have done a great job at disguising any ugliness that these screens may have kind of had by design. And again, ultimately, that's a totally subjective opinion. Objectively, you would hope that these Aeroscreens are going to be a great advocate for safety. They're going to help prevent any injuries. I was at Pocono 2015, so I anything to prevent something like that from happening again, I have to get behind, no doubt about it. One of the big challenges, though, has been the cooling. Because, of course, most IndyCar drivers are used to having 200-mile-per-hour wind blowing not only in their face but all over their suit because of the nature of an open cockpit race car. And when you essentially close the cockpit, I'm sure there is a top that you can get in and out of, an opening at the top of the car, but there isn't going to be a ton of air coming in that because it's going to be going over the top of the screen. So what have they done? Well, they have several different solutions. The first one is right at the front of the car. There are two little inlets on the nose which suck air in and hopefully send it up the cockpit to the driver. Now, here is something interesting about that, is that some teams were testing with the old nose without the inlets in them. So here's the thing that I'm going to be interested to see this year. Teams that are desperate to cut drag, particularly at tracks like Texas Motor Speedway or the Indianapolis 500, are they going to be willing to pay the drag penalty to have a more comfortable driver for 500 miles? I wonder. I wonder if teams like Penske are not going to run those little vents unless they're absolutely, if they have to. If there's some IndyCar mandate about a certain temperature that everybody has to run those inlets, maybe that'll be something. I don't know. There were also two extra inlets, which we've seen, I think, since day one, with the Aeroscreen right underneath the Aeroscreen, which forces air kind of towards the driver's face. And something that was pretty fascinating and new for this test, at least that we've really been able to see up close, was another air snorkel that would go behind the driver's head, depending on where the fuel is actually coming in. They want to do that on the opposite side, as reported by Tony Kanaan during the broadcast, because, of course, if the car catches on fire, you don't want an air scoop to potentially feed flames into a helmet. But this is going to be another aspect that I'm going to be interested to see what happens. How many teams? I think most of the teams are probably going to run this air pipe to the helmet to help cool the driver. The question I have then, again, is the drag question. How are teams going to maximize or minimize the effect that a snorkel kind of poking out over the top of an Aeroscreen, how are they going to innovate to minimize that drag, that potential drag penalty from driver cooling, from a driver cooling perspective? That's going to be the interesting thing, I think, with the Aeroscreen, is seeing how the teams interact with it, how they adapt to it, and what are the solutions to not only have driver comfort, but also to make sure that the car is performing as fast as it can. That'll be fun to see going forward. So that's everything that we learned at the IndyCar testing for Circuit of the Americas. Thank you guys so much for watching, and thank you for Austin, or to Austin, for going to Austin for me in my absence. Thank you to Circuit of the Americas for being so accommodating with that. My original plan had been to go myself and cover it. Unfortunately, I waited too long, and the flights got too expensive, and it wasn't realistic to do when I'm also planning on doing St. Pete and Sebring and Long Beach going forward. It just wasn't a good idea. But I'm glad I was able to at least get you guys some exclusive footage, some exclusive content from that test for this channel. And thank you to all the Patreon supporters to help make stuff like that possible. So thank you guys so much for watching. This has been David Land on YouTube, and I will see you in the next video.